it shows the Lenin picture that we have as a background, and then oh, we're live. Should have told me.
Oh, sorry. Shoot, now it's not loading.
We're technologically challenged over here at Midwestern Marks.
Gosh. Technological difficulties ruined our cool intro plans. Let's refresh it. That was awesome. Once we
McKinsey
got it
is
rolling. The name of that
Right?
song, it's not this. Varshavienka. Carlos could probably pronounce it better than me. By the Red Army Choir. What's
I
up,
think it's
Carlos?
called
How's it going?
Tatanka.
Oh,
It's going good. I'm watching myself on the computer and I see the Wi-Fi is still ass.
it is. But we already got a $5 super sticker. Whoa, thank
Oh
you,
my
Layla.
god.
We'll put that right towards buying Carlos a better internet connection. We thought we did that already, but thank you so much, though, for real. Sup, I've been on your TikTok for a minute, but I watched the end of your video and I saw you have a YouTube. You bet. Vouch. You getting it figured out, Carlos?
Yeah, I'm
Tell
just gonna
everyone in your house to
relocate
turn their
real
Wi-Fi
quick
off.
because I'm gonna have to be a real Stalinist from now on and not let anyone use the Wi-Fi when I try to stream. I'll be off and I'll come back on.
Okay. Well, how's everybody doing? Biden just canceled 10K in student debt. That's kind of cool. Kind of cool. I mean, socialist internet. This is capitalist internet. By the way, I made a TikTok about this. Mediacom is trying to rob me. They're trying to rip me off. Steal $700 for me. Yeah, that's capitalist telecom companies got to be the first thing to go. I mean, they usually are. When a country goes socialist, one of the first things they do is nationalize the telecom companies. And the telecom companies in the U.S. are particularly bad for a few reasons. But one of them is that they profit off the prison industrial complex. So you know how like you have to pay to make a phone call when you're in the clink? AT&T and Verizon and other giant telecom companies make a bunch of money off that, which is one of the reasons they lobby for, stricter drug laws and other things like that. So those are always some of the most powerful companies and some of the first that should be nationalized. It's on brand not to have the best internet for a comrade. It really is, isn't it? Like I was watching The Gray Zone today or yesterday, and their audio was like echoing, and like Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate always have themselves muted when they try and talk. So it's like it's like, I don't know, even though I really look up to those guys, I feel like they also have the internet struggles as us and the audio struggles as us. As they should. Control the communication and you control the narrative. Yeah, now it's Silicon Valley tech companies as well, because so much of that's just a product of the technological revolution. So much communication now is done over the internet and stuff like that. So, yeah, but Carlos and I were going to talk about Biden canceling 10K in student debt. I don't know. His approval ratings are really low, really low. A lot of people have just given up on him. Looking forward to the stream, comrades. Thank you, Ramiro. Happy to see you here. Everyone go follow Ramiro Sebastian Afuñez. But what was I saying? Yeah, Biden's approval ratings are like 30% ish, and I was telling someone, I don't know who, can't remember who I was telling this to, but like I remember when Biden first got in office, he had promised so many people he was going to be better than Trump. And then like one of the first things he did was increase the military budget and bomb Syria because he's an imperialist Democrat, neoliberal. who is never going to be better than Trump. Yeah, but there was like a huge outrage about it. People were like, "What? I can't believe Biden would do this. He promised us to be better than Trump," which is, it was kind of naive, but it is what it is. Some people really thought he was going to be better than Trump. But then he just bombed Syria recently, and like I didn't even see anyone talking about it. I literally don't know if anyone even covered it outside of our media circles, online here or whatever. So, it's crazy how, like, he's just, of course, gone back on every campaign promise he made. And those who are supporting him at this point are pretty much just gonna ride and die with the Democratic Party. So he's got to do something to get his approval rating up, or it's going to be an electoral disaster for the Democrats. There's my political analysis. That's what I got my degree for, huh? Nationalize all the medias. Yeah, Telesur is like the best media in the world, and that's Venezuelan state media. So there you have it. Hopefully Carlos comes back at some point, huh? The debt is inconsequential. We'll be back here in a year. It's not like people are going to stop taking out student loans. Right. I mean, and that's the thing. They compound with interest. So this doesn't get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is usury and, the financial oligarchy that controls our government and controls most of the world economy. Because the richest people in the world and the richest banks in the world make most of their money by just keeping people in debt and charging them interest. So you're just paying and paying and paying, and it constantly compounds on itself, and you're in this sinking hole. And, a lot of this now is medical debt because everyone needs healthcare. And that system's been totally commodified. So whenever you have an emergency, you go further into debt. So, they can be like, here you go, peasants, vote for us again in the next election, and we'll cancel 10% of the debt. But it doesn't cut to the root of the problem. The root of the problem would be nationalizing the banks. I mean, that would be getting to the root of the problem. Using the banks for the interest of the people, canceling their debts, and, funding developmental loans and other such things. The Bible and the Quran bans usury. Yeah, exactly. This is why so many like ancient religions and ancient texts have like banned usury, because it's like the most exploitative way to make money out of nothing, make money without doing anything except for exploiting and making life worse for others. So I mean, you have banks who then have made this their whole business practice, who are the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in the entire country. It ain't good. It's not good, and it's not what Jesus would want. I don't care what your youth pastor told you or whatever. Medical debtors should take up arms, literally. Late night philosophy. Yeah, if Carlos comes back, I don't know if I can give you all the late night philosophy you require. Old man Biden needs an approval bump before midterms. So this was an easy get. As an ex-college professor myself, I approve, but it's still breadcrumbs. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. That's exactly what I think it is. Let's see if Carlos is texting me. I will ask him if he's alive. Can you explain the Fed? There's some part in... Now it's all blurring together, and my brain's kind of mush right now. It's past my bedtime. But there's some part in Lenin where he talks about the longer that capitalist imperialism develops, or maybe this is in Vijay Prashad, but at some point in capitalist development, once you have the creation of this sort of financial oligarchy, and the banks and the manufacturers have merged to become the ruling class, the state becomes a tool of capital, obviously. And then you have the establishment of state and national banks then, because it makes it easier to control the money supply, and just, financial movement, and the movement of capital in general. And then you have that on a global level with the IMF and the World Bank, which, are controlled by financial capitalists in the West and in London and Wall Street mostly, but they're the same sort of thing on the global level. Federal Reserve is truly owned by the banks and not the government. They print money from thin air and loan it to the government and charge interest. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that scheme, but it probably is. There's literally more debt than money. Yeah, that is true. All of our taxes literally go to the banks to pay for interest. The government never runs out of money. They print it up whenever they want, except for the people, only for the rich. Yes, and that's what Bernie calls. Bernie's always like, they have socialism for the rich, and rugged individualism for the poor, which is like, he's talking about them bailing out the banks anytime they fail. And that's what they mean by socialism for the rich, as well as, tax breaks and corporate subsidies and stuff like that. And like, that's not socialism for the rich. That's just capitalism. Capitalism always co-ops the state, right? It always uses the state to create things like national banks, which are ultimately just an arm of capital, an arm of propping up capital. And yeah, and people don't understand the state that way. There's so many so-called socialists who I have seen defending Biden expanding the IRS. I swear to you guys. And they're like, Biden's going to send these IRS agents after the rich. He's sending them after the rich people. Like, are you on crack? Like, are you serious with that? You think Joe Biden is going to direct these IRS agents at the rich people? Joe Biden helped co-write the crime bill. Joe Biden helped militarize our police and keep the prison industrial complex full of bodies. While his son was doing hard drugs, continually partying, and just failing upwards, continually being put on the boards of giant energy firms, corporate energy firms, making hundreds of thousands of dollars, just bouncing in and out of different rehab facilities. As his dad is in office and in a position of power, which is the only reason Hunter's able to fail upward like that, signing laws that militarize the police and throw poor people in jail for doing, minor drug offenses, much more minor than what Biden's son is doing. Which is why Democrats, just because Republicans talked about Hunter Biden's laptop, Democrats want to act like it's a conspiracy theory, but people should read the contents of what was in there. It's really fascinating. What's up, Carlos? Carlos has returned.
What's up, brother? Is the is the connection good?
Yeah. Did you read that last YouTube comment there? Is that what you're laughing at? That's what I was laughing at.
Eddie? No, I hadn't seen it. Which one are you talking about?
This one.
No, I haven't seen it, but I've
That's
heard
someone who's read the contents of the laptop thoroughly. Did you get your Wi-Fi figured out?
I think so. I think you got to be the judge of that, because it looks good on my end, and then I go see the videos afterwards, and it's ass. But is the video quality okay? Am I freezing?
It looks way better. It looks better than it ever has, honestly.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I did something right.
Yes. I want to ask you some questions about Gramsci, because my interpretation of him has always been kind of what you've been telling me lately. Sorry, what are you laughing at?
Someone, never mind.
Oh my God. I see.
Jesus. It's that time of the night for some people, I guess.
It is. I get it. Midwestern Marks after dark. Um,
Dark Midwestern marks, right?
so Carlos has been studying Gramsci for a recent project, and my interpretation of Gramsci, or kind of what I saw just from seeing quotes of him and other people talk about him. I've never gotten to um, read any of his core works, but sort of that he expands the Marxist analysis to media and education and sort of the superstructure, which is sort of what like the Frankfurt School and the sort of pseudo Marxist Western anti-existing socialism intellectuals, largely in France throughout the 60s and 70s, said they were doing. And sometimes they said their stuff was based on Gramsci. But if you would just talk a little bit about what the core of Gramsci's work is about, and then how it differs from the Frankfurt School that we've criticized in the past.
Um, yeah. So as you mentioned, I was contracted to do a project to co-write a chapter for a Gramsci anthology on specifically the topic of intellectuals, but I took the opportunity to spend the last 4 or 5 months intensively reading the collection of the notebooks, the collection of his pre-imprisonment articles, and some of the letters that he sends out while in prison. So Gramsci's an interesting figure. He's a militant from the time that he's very young. He's one of the founders of the Italian Communist Party, um, and he's dealing with the situation that after the October Revolution takes place, Lenin and pretty much everyone was expecting revolutions to just start popping up in Europe, specifically Germany, Britain, France, and that ends up not being the case, right? So they end up analyzing why was it that these revolutions didn't take place in these other European countries that, according to the traditional Marxist conception of what would lead to a revolution, they should have first of all came first, but now that they didn't come first, why haven't they arisen? So that's the sort of framework that Gramsci is asking all of his questions in, because he is, as I mentioned, a communist. He's a militant in the party. He's a party leader, and his theorizing is always grounded in how the hell are we going to establish socialism, right? So in terms of like the first immediate difference with the Frankfurt School, it one of the first ones would be that we're talking about someone that's in a communist party and that's active in the process of trying to build socialism that has the correct responses to the colonial and imperial question, right? His articles from before imprisonment are really, really good. He's very critical of colonialism. He's taking the traditional Marxist-Leninist position on it, but his writing is very potent. It's very strong. He uses insane imageries to describe the relationship between the empire and the colony. Uh, so it's very different in general from the Frankfurt School. And when he looks at the question, why haven't these revolutions taken place? The response that he gives is that, well, in Western Europe, the state developed because of the 1848 revolutions of the previous century, because of the Paris Commune and other similar experiments. The state developed um, a civil society. It took under its wing civil society, and it became a more integral state. And I think this notion of the integral state, of a state that's not just the political apparatuses, but also civil society, is something that is important for us today, because you look at NGOs and in the name non-governmental organizations, but who do they do the work for? They do the work for the governments that do the work for the finance capitalists, the monopoly capitalists, right? And by dividing civil society from state, they're able to get away with things that state institutions wouldn't be able to do so directly. But Gramsci is saying that, part of the modern state is the development of that civil society, and in civil society, that's where really hegemony begins to take root. That's where you have the intellectuals at the highest level. You have various scientists and philosophers at the lower levels. You have functionaries and administrators that are allowing the ideas of the existing order to disseminate across the population. So he realizes that whereas in Russia, that hadn't consolidated because the revolution comes literally basically right after the overthrow of Tsarism, that civil society hadn't consolidated. They hadn't been able to develop hegemony to the level that Western Europe had been able to. And so the fight takes up has to have a different nature than the one that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had in what Lenin described as the weakest link of European imperialism. Their fight was more frontal. It was more of a direct attack, what Gramsci and military strategists call a war of maneuver or a war of movement. It was that direct warfare against the state and the ruling classes. In the West, the focus should be on a war of positions, which is the concept really that he uses. He brings it in from military strategy, and he uses it to describe the ideological warfare that we have to take up, the war in the sphere of the superstructures, the war in the sphere of ideology, in the sphere of culture. And one of the central things that he's looking at and that he's critiquing certain Marxists that he agrees with politically, that are Marxist-Leninists, like Bukharin, some of the things that he's critiquing about these people is that they're not taking seriously common sense. Because ideology ultimately ingrains itself in the common sense of people, in the world's views that are incoherent, fragmentary, contradictory, but that shape the lives of people, right? In that sense, he says every person is a philosopher because everyone engages with the world with a specific worldview. We have to take that sort of spontaneous philosophy, that common sense, seriously, because within the common sense of the masses, you're going to find the embryos, you're going to find the germs, the cell, the basic unit, out of which you can begin to rearticulate the common sense from its existing alignment with bourgeois ideology towards socialist ideology. So it's a project that it's much more cultural in nature, but all that really means is that you have to win over the masses. You have to win over the masses. You have to have their common sense connect to socialist ideals and to socialist feelings. That's something that's also never usually talked about. We usually just talk about convincing and rational convincing. He says passions and emotions play a role in that as well. So I think that that changes the way that we think about how we have to relate to the masses. And some of the things that he theorized about have become basically common sense to us nowadays. Other things that should be common sense to a lot of us haven't been, right? You can't appeal to the masses if you're so disconnected from them that they're just going to look at you as if you're crazy, right? It's like the meme that we've sent around in some group chats before. Is that what the working class is like? Is that what communism is? I want no part of that, right? You can't do that. You have to have some connection to the common sense of the people, to their popular sentiments, to their popular beliefs, and in that incoherence, develop the germs towards socialist consciousness. And that requires, of course, dialectical, a critical, a concrete analysis of society, of the ideas of the masses, and not just a sort of rejection. If you cancel the masses and if you just call them backwards, they're backwards because that's the ideology of the existing order. If you want to change that, you got to do the work to change that, which means you got to study it. You got to critique it imminently, which means you got to understand why they believe that, find the germs, and then rearticulate, so redirect those germs that are radical towards socialist ends. So in my opinion, like in the U.S., we have a founding document, the Declaration of Independence, that is vague enough that it was used in the 19th century by abolitionists. It was used by the first generation of socialists. And then parts of it were taken up by Ho Chi Minh in the Declaration of Independence for Vietnam. It was taken up by Fidel Castro in History Will Absolve Me in 1953. And that ideal that 100% of Americans, or at least most of them, agree with, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, government of, by, for the people, that's ingrained into the common sense of most Americans. And if we want to appeal to that common sense in order to bring them to socialism, we have to rearticulate the idea of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, government of, by, and for the people from the connection it has to bourgeois ideology towards socialist ideology. And I don't think there's any easier task than that, right? How is a society, a mode of life which prioritizes the accumulation of profit, which sustains power in the hands of a very small amount of people, how does it promote life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Right? How does a country that allow these sort of drug overdoses that, the recent video you did that allows the mass poverty, the homelessness, the amount of 60,000 people that are dying from lack of medical insurance, when there's a plethora of resources for them, there's people dying of hunger. There's almost half of the children in this country are going hungry, and it's the wealthiest nation in the history of the planet. How does that promote life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Where's the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for the vast majority of people? And then look at the government. Is that really a government of, by, and for the people? So I think that if we look at Gramsci, what he was trying to do, his project of focusing on disconnecting the masses from the ideology of the ruling class, connecting them to socialist forms of thinking and feeling, and then doing so through appealing to common sense, it'll lead us, I think, in the United States to these sorts of analysis. And maybe in different communities is different analysis, right? The United States is not a homogenous mass. There's different sections of the country and different regions that think differently, that feel differently, that have different cultures, and that must be studied, each one of them concretely, in order to precisely do what you have to do, which is get to their common sense and reorient them to socialism.
Wow, that's really informative. I think it is. I mean, I think that's super pertinent for today, like you said. Obviously, it's something that you've been working on for a while, so I can tell that you've been thinking about this or these ideas for a minute now. But there's a couple things that I want to say about that. But first of all, thank you, Frick Frack, for the
Thank you.
super chat. That's awesome. And David for the $5 super sticker. Really appreciate the
David.
support, y'all. Yeah,
David
I want.
was your first Patreon, by the way. So shout out David.
Yeah, it's a Patreon supporter, and he sends us the super stickers. What a
He's
super
homie.
fan, super comrade. Yeah, I wonder. The first thing that came to my mind was I wonder if Mao, what time would Mao have had a chance to read Gramsci when he's doing his thing? When was Gramsci writing the prison notebooks?
He goes to he gets locked up, I think, in 26 or 28, 1926 or 28, and he dies in the mid to late 30s. He didn't have a chance to read them, and they don't get published until maybe a few decades after. His popular work, the stuff he wrote, like quick 3 to 4 page articles that he was constantly writing for the few socialist outlets that he was writing for before he got imprisoned, they're good, but I don't think they were good enough to like make their rounds to China. It was really hard for the Chinese to get translations of things. Right.
Right.
I'm watching right now a show that Ken Hammond, who's a historian, a professor, he's a scholar, I think, at PSL. He does really good work on China, but he recommended the show The Age of Awakening, which I think I recommended it to you and Noah, or to the Ed board. But it's a show that traces the eventual founders of the Communist Party of China. Uh, it traces their development towards Marxism, and one of the biggest difficulties that you see is translations. Right, there's not many translations of Marx, the manifesto. By 1918, it's not even fully translated, and they're working with like a half-assed Japanese translation. So I don't think that Mao would have had a chance to work through Gramsci.
It's interesting. I just think that, or I had that thought because somebody put in the chat, we need to uphold a mass line, and it is similar to Mao. I mean, Mao put so much emphasis on cultural revolution and changing the ideology of the people, and part of that's because they're transitioning out of this feudal culture that was really oppressive and patriarchal, and had some awful tendencies. But part of it was about consolidating support, not only by bringing material support to the people, but by convincing them. There's all of this about, go to the backwards masses, even the people with the most backwards ideas, and meet them where they're at. And this is something we talked about I think we were even discovering it as early as the Bernie campaign, when we were both pretty early in our journey of understanding Marx, because we were like, were learning Marx at the time. We're like, we can convince, working class Americans to vote for Bernie better or to support socialism more from a strictly socialist Marxist point of view than we could from a social democratic point of view. Because, you just, you had all the talking points that the Bernie people would give you, heavily focused on social issues a lot of the time. But if you would just hit on, healthcare or hit on these issues of class, wages, collective bargaining rights, things like that, that are universal for, everybody except for those who own capital. Everybody can agree on these things, and everyone, not the Republican politicians, but the Republican voters know that, the government's corrupt. So it's, meeting them where they're at and then explaining, okay, who is the government corrupted by? The capitalists. Okay, where do the capitalists get their power from? Ownership of the tools and the factories or the means of production. Okay, how do we organize our struggle based on class then, and fighting those who are corrupt? And people get it if you meet them where they're at, but there's such a resistance right now, and there's such an isolation, I feel like, in Western society, that um it's almost like the capitalists understand, that that if there was a socialist movement that actually did go to the masses thoroughly and meet them where they're at, that it'd be dangerous for the ruling class ultimately. But yeah, what do you think? How specifically do we apply Gramsci then? I know you said in the U.S., studying the conditions of where you're at, and then showing how the ideals that people believe in, even if those are ideals of the Constitution or whatever, like right to life, um, appealing to those and saying there's no right to life in a country where you can die where because you don't have health insurance or whatever else. I don't know. Do you have any other examples of how we can apply Gramsci to the struggle today? Another thought I had was we've talked about waging the ideological struggle online.
Right.
That's one kind of place we could apply it, I guess.
Well, we're kind of doing it now. We have to think of um, the superstructure as composed of uh, plural fields of struggle, right? So, like when you engage in Twitter and Instagram and streams like we are right now, we're in an ideological field, and by spreading these ideas, we are to some extent waging ideological warfare, right? Engaging in the war of position that Gramsci was talking about. But to get back to your question, look, some of it is just common sense, right? If you're going to teach a kid who is not very knowledgeable about something, you start by the closest thing that they already know that is related to where you want to take them. And then slowly, through going back to those points of references with the things that they already know, you can develop something new. And, as someone who teaches intro to philosophy to people who have never picked up a philosophy text, one of the things that I'm constantly trying to do is bring up common phrases or use movies in my classes or go back to the things that the people know, but they don't necessarily know that they know, and make them reflect on that and then tie that point of reference to the ideas that I'm trying to get them to engage with in the history of philosophy. But that's with the history of philosophy. If you want to do that with socialist struggle, you could do the same thing. But we have to realize, one of the things that distinguishes scientific from utopian socialism is how systematic you're studying the existing order. If you're just looking at superficially the results of capitalism, as the Saint Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owens were, they'd be disgusted by those results. Maybe they were disgusted by those results. Maybe they could make some connections here or there, but they ended up always postulating a new world outside of the existing one. It was a sort of escapism, right? Scientific socialism sees within the existing order itself the seeds for a new world. That's one of the central differences between scientific socialism and utopian socialism. You analyze the contradictions in the existing mode of life, and you see how out of those, there's the potential for imminently from inside a new world to arise. And the sort of bearer, the agent of that potential, Marx and Engels saw was the proletariat. And then other theorists saw that in different conditions, it might be the peasantry or the peasantry and the proletariat, etc. So we know that there's contradictions in the economy that allow for the imminent dialectical development of socialism. You have the socialization of production, the privatizing of accumulation. That's one of the basic contradictions. In politics, it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing. You have these contradictions where there's supposedly democracy, but everyone knows that there's no real democracy. In culture, what Gramsci does is basically the same thing that Marx did with political economy. He shows how in culture is so ambiguous and fragmentary and contradictory that out of culture itself you can develop a new socialist culture. So out of the current culture, the current capitalist culture, there's the seeds, the embryo for, if a revolutionary vanguard is successful at doing its job, for developing a new socialist consciousness, a new ideological order, a new culture. And that's consistent with scientific socialism, with how we analyze political economy. We don't treat, socialism as this thing that completely breaks with capitalism. We realize that it carries, as Marx said, the birthmarks of the previous order. We realize that within what we have now, we have the seeds for the next world. It's the same thing with culture. It's the same thing with culture.
I feel like we have some good examples with some of the stuff we've done in terms of going to people where they're at. Like the TikTok videos in general, I guess are going to where at least the youth are at, but really the masses in general, pretty much everyone uses TikTok now. But then your movie reviews that you've done, the Marxist movie reviews have been really some of our more popular videos. Because, some of these videos, like, I mean, these pieces of entertainment like Squid Game or Parasite, even Don't Look Up, like people realize the message behind it, and a lot of times it's a very universal message because it's a class message, and a message about exploitation. So oftentimes that's a good starting point for explaining exploitation on a more systematic or philosophical level, political level. And then another example, I guess we have our Midwestern martial arts series, which I always, I see UFC fighters getting screwed over, and I'm like, it's the same exploitation that you see in any other industry. It's just really obvious to UFC fans. They're always complaining about it, always complaining about how the fighters are underpaid and don't have health care. And it's like those things are universal, and I don't know. It's almost like some leftists, it's like they just almost just hate life, like they hate everything in life, and they're like, because society is bourgeois culture, technically I'm just gonna hate everything. But as you were saying, I don't think that's what scientific socialism is about.
Right. I think Gramsci would be praising what you were able to do with TikTok, because that's exactly what he's referring to, um, both in terms of field, in recognizing what is a field where the struggle could be waged, and then waging it in that field, but also in the way that you've done it, because you've done it in a way that people who have no connection previously to socialism, to Marxism, have been won over, right? So in part, reading Gramsci is kind of like reflecting on some of the things that we've been successful at doing in the last 2 years of our project. But it's so easy. It's so easy right now. We're at a time where American capitalist imperialism is in crisis in literally every field. Like everything is fucked up right now, and it's so easy to get to the masses. I saw a poll the other day. Only 11% of Americans have faith in the media or trust the media, and it's like, maybe that number is even too high. It should be lower, but we should take advantage of this. Why are we not taking advantage of this? I remember when we were working for Bernie, I was knocking doors with our mutual buddy Brock one time, and we encountered a Trump supporter, and one of his biggest things was how CNN produces fake news, and we're like, okay, that critical lens you're taking there is good. Extend it a little bit more. Look at also Fox News and all these other things that also seem objective, but they're actually reflecting the interests of the dominant class. And he was like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then I was like, well, also look at history a little bit and what they tell you about these other countries and socialism. And he was like, holy shit, right. I already developed skepticism for one. It's just a matter of extending it, right? It's easy, but it requires us to get to the masses. It requires us to get to the masses. And I think that, a lot of times in these spaces, we like to dwell on how enlightened we are. And that sort of enlightenment disconnects us from the people that our whole purpose is to get to and to organize and to educate. That's our whole fucking purpose as communists, is to serve as a vehicle of history to move history forward into freer modes of life. And we're not doing that. And I think that the conditions couldn't be any riper for us to do it.
It's like it is. It's mine. It's kind of crazy how easy it is. When you just reach out to people and meet them where they're at and sort of explain scientific socialism from a very simple point of view. Based on the things that universally are affecting the working class. And shoot, what was I gonna say? I totally lost my train of thought. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, and one of the main things, one of the most harmful ideas, I think, and this goes back to like the ruling class and their state apparatus and whatever apparatuses they use, including controlled opposition. One of their goals is to keep people isolated and keep people from unifying. And in the modern political era, one of the number one ways they've done that, even though the conditions, as you said, are ripe for revolution, everybody's feeling the effects of the capitalist economy in crisis. But there's this idea among leftists and socialists that all Trump supporters are fascists. That they are all just unapproachable. So that this mass group of angry people, a lot of them working class, we're just not allowed to talk to them. They're completely off limits. They're isolated. No unifying with them or no going to them and meeting them where they're at and trying to convince them to be Marxist because it's dangerous. They're too fascistic. And that might make sense if you hear it on Twitter or if you hear it in a socialist group at your college or at a party meeting or whatever. But like then if you go, like there were massive John Deere strikes in the Midwest and all the John Deere manufacturing workers were on strike. And of course we went and stood on the picket lines with them and supported them in their struggle against the boss, the capitalist class, John Deere, which is owned by like BlackRock and Vanguard. Wall Street hedge funds. And a lot of the people we were on the picket line with voted for Trump. Yeah. But if you talk to them about, their class position and the struggle against their boss and the struggle to unite their workplace and struggle for better wages, more vacation time, these things that are universal, healthcare, stuff like that. They were getting their healthcare benefits ripped away. Like, you realize that the struggles of these people are the same as the struggles of a liberal working class person. And that's why we organize by class, and that's why every revolutionary leader is organized by class, not by political leanings, especially in bourgeois elections where we know where the only choices are ruling class candidates anyways. So I think that's sort of been a bulwark to unity. Not that we just want to unify with everyone, but we want to go to people and take their concerns seriously and not treat them as a basket of deplorables or a basket of idiots.
Right. And what's funny is that so many of these people that they'll have pictures of Lenin and Stalin and Mao on their profiles, they would be the first ones that, if they were in the parties of those historical figures they admire so much, they'd be one of the first ones purged, because the sort of attitudes they take to the masses are shooting themselves in the foot. You're shooting yourself as a vanguard in the foot when you take that attitude to the masses, because the word vanguard means something. It means that you take the block of the working class or the working masses and you're the most advanced detachment of it, and you're supposed to go down to the masses in order to bring them up. You're not supposed to, from up, look down at the masses and say, you guys suck. I can't organize you. You're fascist. I'm going to stay up here with all the people that are already enlightened. That's the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be going to all sections of the working class, all poor people, and trying to organize them, because they can all change their mind, right? If we're really confident that truth is on our side, and I'm someone who I think it is, truth is Marxist, reality is Marxist, as Chase said. If we're really confident of that, we should be able to very easily convince every working person, whether they're socially conservative or liberal, that socialism is the alternative that they need and that their problems, if they're of the conservative kind, that their problems are not gay people, trans people, immigrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That their problems are the capitalists, right? Black and white unite and fight. That's always been the communist slogan. It's only as of very recently where certain communists have taken up the slogan that if you voted for Trump, even if you're a working class person, you're a piece of shit and you're a fascist.
Yeah, I think part of it stems, part of the resistance to reach out to working class people and have these tough conversations and meet them where they're at is a lack of sort of understanding of the theory. So then you lack trust in it that it is correct, So you're just trying to, everybody who attacks Marxism or my conception of Marxism in my head based on what my Twitter friend said, is a fascist and evil and I hate them. Whereas if you read the theory, of course, like we said, Mao and all the greatest theorists are about going to the masses. And then, it makes you more confident in their analysis, right? It makes you more confident in explaining scientific socialism to people and explaining how capitalism works. Because really, Marxism is the study of production. And the mode of production we're in right now is capitalism. So it's the study of capitalism, explaining to people the system that they're in. And so people don't understand that well. And then there's a bulwark, of course, to explaining it to people. So that's the importance of reading, which, for whatever reason, the modern left there's a debate about whether it's classist to tell people to read or not, but reading is good for you. It'll help. And then, the other thing that stems from that is the lack of class analysis, right? Like reading the theory, reading about scientific socialism, you understand the importance of class. You see class as the only sort of signifier, the way to divide people that is both historical and material. And therefore, that's what we have to base our struggle in. So, yeah, I'm just always hitting on the importance of reading and education. Because if you read and educate yourself, you're going to be able to connect with people better and share information with them better and be able to meet more people where they're at and explain to them more accurately, how their problems stem from capitalism.
Right. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. I remember when we started with the Bernie campaign, how nervous were we to just go up to random fucking people and talk to them about politics as a socialist, right? How difficult is that? But with time, with a few days of talking to people, of having maybe some weird interactions here and there, you get used to it and you get better. Like anything you do in life, the more you do it, the more you repeat, the better it is. And that gets to another point that you made in the TikTok that you did on the FBI raids when Trump's house in Mar-a-Lago was being raided, which interestingly enough, our project senior counseling editor, he ended up making a post about it, and it was like the same analysis that you made. So it says something that when an 80-year-old communist who's been a communist his whole life, party member, scholar, professor for 60 years, gets at the same analysis, it means we're doing something right. But one of the things you said at the end, you were talking about talking to your neighbor, right? And how even if they reject it at first, you don't stop. You keep talking to them because just think yourself. I think most of you weren't red diaper babies. I'm willing to bet most of you weren't red diaper babies. How did you come to accept Marxism? How did you come to take the leap of reading and accepting the ideology? It was a process, and it's going to be a process with the people we talk to. Most people are not going to be like, wow, I accept everything from the first conversation. It's a process, and it's hard work, right? We're not saying it's going to be easy. The conditions are right for it, but it's still going to take a whole lot of fucking work. But we have to be willing to do the work, and a lot is at stake. We live uncomfortable lives unnecessarily. We continue funding a military apparatus in order to sustain the empire that is unnecessary, that's keeping the lives of billions of people around the world in precarity, in poverty, and stress of whether or not they're going to get bombed. That's absurd. We have more in common with the people we're bombing abroad than with the people who lead the country, the people who own the factories that made those weapons. So it's the conditions are ripe, but we have to do a whole lot of work. And I think that's it's easier to lay back on social media, talk about how right your views are, and condemn the people who don't have them. That's a very easy, pessimistic solution to have, and I think it's one that's grounded in the some of the pessimism that comes out of the New Left and the Frankfurt School. It's a very route
Individualism.
to take, right? Individualism, right? It's a very easy route to take, and it's harder than doing what we have to do, which is putting in a shitload of work and talking to as many people as we can, as many times as we can.
Yeah, I mean, you make a super good point there. I relate it to teaching and coaching, which, any good or experienced teacher knows. Oftentimes it takes multiple times going over the same thing, even explaining it over and over and over again before a kid gets something. And what can be the most frustrating thing is like sometimes someone even needs to hear it from a different voice. So you have
Hmm.
like a kid you're trying to teach something to, and you tell them and tell them and tell them and tell them a million different ways, and they don't get it. And then someone else comes along and tells it to them, and they get it right away. It just for whatever reason they were open to learning from that person, and that person was able to meet them where they are at or tell them what they needed to know to allow a breakthrough at that point. So yeah, that's why it takes a lot of hard work, and it takes, a diverse collective. It's going to take a mass effort. But also, like, it is hard and it does take a lot of convincing, but it's very possible. Um, for us and for probably the people in the audience, it did take time to become a Marxist, but not too much time, for us to see it. And then and like one thing I noticed with Bernie too is like you mentioned walking up to people and talking to them about socialism and how it was scary, and it was, but quickly I realized nobody knows shit about socialism. And even just studying with Bernie, I knew way more about socialism with them or than they did. And now, of course, it's not even close after doing a few years of reading and study. So people are like starved of this information, starved of this understanding of how the world works. They're not as indoctrinated by the Red Scare as the previous generation. So it just takes going to these people. I was thinking in my head, my girlfriend was in this chat earlier. I don't know if she's still in here. But like she asked me, and this is, what I have to do anytime somebody finds my YouTube videos, basically. She's like, wait, so do you like China? Like, is China good? I thought China was bad. And I'm like, what I've started doing when people ask me, I'm like, okay, why do you think China's bad? They're like, I don't know. I'm just supposed to think it's bad. And I'm
Right.
like, so you have no idea why you think China's bad? You just think it's bad? And yes, it's, that's how the hegemony or I guess the culture, the civil society puts common sense ideas in people's heads, even if they're ridiculous ideas like China's this evil comic book villain. That's just the common sense idea. But in through explaining it and dismantling it and talking about how the UN has recognized China's poverty alleviation programs as the greatest, one of the greatest human rights accomplishments ever.
Hmm.
um, you can kind of debunk the myth for people like that and give them, if not a fully pro-China perspective, a much, much, much more nuanced perspective. And then, because, as we've been saying, the truth is on our side, then they go watch mainstream media and they're like, this is absurd. This doesn't make as much sense as what Eddie told me. Eddie's explanation was super in depth and talked about their economy and talked about how the media just lies and makes it super simplistic. Now I'm watching the media and they're just making it super simplistic, acting like China are comic book villains. So, if you lead people in the right direction, they'll eventually see it themselves.
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a funny question. At some point, like we have to just get like Xi Jinping tattooed, so that instead of answering, we could just show our wrists and you see Xi Jinping's face. But no, my sister told me today that right in front of her school, there's a little pre-K, and the big sign that the school has at the front, it, you know what it said? It said, "China is not our friend." where, where do these people get these ideas from? Well, it's, these ideological apparatuses, and they're really stupid ideas that are really easy to debunk when you start talking to people. Um, so yeah, that's
Yeah. And I think part of reaching the Trump people is showing them like Tucker Carlson and those guys are like mirrors of wokeism, right? They're pushing you towards the cultural struggle. And, maybe Tucker hits on some of the economic struggles people face and how they're connected to imperialism and constantly, sending or using our money on war abroad, but they're ultimately not directing you towards class struggle. So breaking that down for people too, sort of how the right wing media works, is good as well, I think.
Right, and it's a difference between true opinion and then knowledge, right? When Tucker gets it right, it's a distinction that Plato used to make. When Tucker gets it right, it's accidental true opinions. When we get it right, is knowledge. We know the mechanisms behind it that necessarily lead to the effects that then accidentally Tucker ends up getting right, analyzing. And he also gets it right a lot of times opportunistically, right? Because he wants to pull people in, and it's very easy to call that out. So um, we one of the it's an argument that I often repeat, but one of the things that we have on the ideologues of the bourgeoisie and the pundits is that we actually engage with all sorts of material, all sorts of media. So we can tell them what they're going to see when they go on and turn on MSNBC, CNN, and when they go on and turn on Fox News. We're going to tell them what they're going to say and why what they're going to say is wrong. Whereas it can't be done the other way around because truth is on our side, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what we were talking about earlier with like we get accused of living in an echo chamber and not reading other sources or liberal sources or mainstream sources. It's like that's half of what we do. Is read liberal sources and explain to you how dumb and wrong they are. Is go through pages and pages of Human Rights Watch reports, the Human Rights Organization with CIA members on their board, or Adrian Zenza's reports about China, the NED agent who said he's on a mission from God to destroy China, an evangelical fanaticist. Parsing through their nonsense reports aimed at regime change. So you can not only, when the truth is on your side, can you debunk corporate media, but you can steelman all of the arguments of your opponents in order to show how they're ridiculous.
Right. And what's interesting is that, these are the same people, especially the folks on the right, that in their rejection of postmodernism, which I think postmodernism ought to be rejected, it's fully antagonistic to Marxism. But in their rejection to postmodernism, to any semblance of objective truth, of, of, of certain objective standards that go beyond relativism, that go beyond subjectivist interpretations of the world, they're also like the least logical. They're the ones that are always talking about, facts and logic. Ben Shapiro beats liberal with facts and logic, but they have as bad arguments as the liberals do. It's horrific arguments, and a lot of the times, like when they argue for things, if you really look at it, and it's the same thing with liberals. They're not arguments. Like they wouldn't classify as arguments. If you go to a logic class, they teach you to make an argument you need a series of premises and then a conclusion that follows from those premises. You can't just say the conclusion in different ways and then say that's an argument, right? Like I've talked to people about Cuba, conservatives about Cuba, that they say the blockade doesn't exist, and I'm like, well, how come? Give me your reasons for that, and they're like, no, trust me, it doesn't exist, and then they just say the same thing in different ways, and I'm like, do you realize how that's not an argument? You're just giving me the same conclusion, the same premiseless conclusion through different wordings. That's not an argument. Let me give you an argument for why it does exist, and then you give them the reasons, and they can't say anything in return. But it's interesting. They see themselves as the heir of the traditions of enlightenment, of the sort of the best factions of the history of bourgeois thought, and they're really the opposite of that. Like all of the self-proclaimed heroes that they have, like they bring up Adam Smith as a conservative thinker, as a free market defender, as someone who'd be against government intervention. And it's like I want them to read Adam Smith. He was calling out the bullshit of the owning classes that are constantly coming into trust and forming cartels and cooperating with each other to manipulate markets, but then they want to say that workers don't have a right to form unions. Adam Smith was calling that out as hypocritical, and he was fully in favor of workers forming unions. He was against the activities that the capitalists do to manipulate markets. The whole point of his political economy was, as you know, as it's been in the tradition of philosophy, to try to establish as just an order as possible. So, you know, the idea of the invisible hand was a mediational idea for the ultimate end of his political economy, which is, you know, what's the best way to have a just society. And the fetishism that develops of the free market in itself as its own end in these conservative places cannot be any farther from Adam Smith. Adam Smith, I'm pretty sure, if he would have been able to live long enough to see how bad, uh, you know, free market capitalism fails, how it necessarily turns dialectically into its opposite, how competition leads to monopoly, as you've been covering very nicely in your series on Lenin, on Lenin's imperialism, he would change his mind because, you know, I think to some extent he's coming from the tradition of he's coming from the tradition of the Scottish thinkers. His teacher was Adam Ferguson, and Adam Ferguson was someone that was criticizing the existing order for some of the inequalities that it was bringing about, the social discohesion that was being brought about, the stupefying that was being brought to the mass of people. And so they appeal to these thinkers, and they couldn't be any farther from even, you know, thinkers from the bourgeois era that we would disagree with, but which are better than the stuff we find today.
I think there's a chance Ricardo and Smith like would have become Marxists with Marx, because they did a lot of good work, like classical economics. You know, Marx critiqued it, but he used kind of the base that they built to finish their analysis and complete their analysis. And neoclassical economics since then is basically a pseudoscience. Is basically, you know, how do we maintain capitalism and keep capitalism going, even though, you know, it's an inherently contradictory system. Um, so yeah, it's like our friend Jiangju says. The right wingers always say facts don't care about your feelings, and it's correct when they say that. They just don't have the right facts, or they don't care about actually care about the facts. But I want to say thank you to Justin Lips Watson. Class collaborators project their own chauvinism.
Thank
Absolutely,
you, Justin.
yeah.
And
And
it's also, oh, sorry. Yeah.
oh, sorry, we got one more super chat from Andrew Ray. Thank you.
Thank
Got a
you,
question
Andrew.
here about China. I can go ahead and say what you were going to say, Carlos, and then we can tackle this China question.
But just real quick, even the question of facts themselves is it's interestingly posed because you don't understand facts if you just look at facts. In order to understand facts, you have to understand the factors that created the conditions for the facts to arise, which means you have to understand things dialectically. You have to look at how the interconnections and movements and history of the sort of context the fact came out of. How does it lead to the fact? Only then do you understand the facts. So they talk about facts, but really they just castrate it from the context, from its factors, and by doing so, they don't understand the facts themselves.
And that's exactly, like, not to get too in depth here because this is kind of in the weeds, and I've studied a lot of bourgeois economics in my day. But what they do in neoclassical economics is they just look at a snapshot of capitalism. You know, here's how the market works at this point, you know, and if the prices are low, then that's good. And if they're producing a lot, then that's good too. And if there's no crises of production, then everything's going
Really good.
great. And you're not allowed to talk about history. You know, it's just like the invisible hand is best and capitalism's best. Like, what about the people before capitalism existed? We didn't always have capitalism. They're like, you know, yeah, well, God came down from the heavens and gave us capitalism at one point, and that's why we need to obey the invisible hand. It's like, you're literally not allowed to talk about history. History starts with capitalism for the neoclassical economists. But as hitting on this question from Andrew Ray, and thank you for the $5 super chat. Says, what would you say in defense of China, to someone who says they're out to get the Uyghurs and Taiwanese and refuse counter evidence? I mean,
Show me the Carfax.
right. I mean, like, how that's like when I first heard the allegations of Uyghur genocide, I was like, oh, let's investigate these, you know, and um, not assume they're true, innocent until proven guilty, but try and find out if they're true, right? Because if there is genocide going on in China, that's very, very serious charge, and something should be done about it, and we should be against it. But when you do that, when you drill down deep and look at all the evidence that these corporate media sources are citing, it's almost always Adrian Zenz, or something directly connected to the World Uyghur Congress, which is an arm of the NED, or something directly coming from the NED, which is literally a CIA cutout, an arm of the State Department. So I don't know what you can do other than, like, if someone just rejects it, I don't know what you can do other than sit down and like break it down with them. But you can debunk pretty much any piece of evidence that someone brings to you. And as for Taiwan, the thing with I feel like Taiwan is such an easy one to explain to Americans once you know the history, because the Kuomintang, the flag that everybody has in their Twitter bio right now, they don't like the Taiwanese separatists, right? Taiwan was a claim that the PRC inherited from the Kuomintang. Taiwan had been part of China since, for like 400 years. And then before the Chinese Civil War between the U.S.-backed Kuomintang and the communists, after they threw out the colonizers, everyone agreed that Taiwan was part of China because Taiwan had always been part of China. And yes, that's where the Kuomintang settled. The non-communists went there, but that doesn't mean they're separatists, right? They still see the people in the mainland as their brothers and sisters. They still see themselves as part of China. There's like 4% of Taiwan that supports Pelosi and that supports the U.S. and that supports separatism. And the only reason those separatists exist is because of the U.S. propping them up and supporting them and allowing them to exist. And most of the people who support Taiwanese separatism are in the diaspora. Really, there's not a lot of people actually in China. But I don't know, if people reject that, then they're just chauvinists. I don't know.
Right, and I think you hit on the nail of the essence of the substance that I think we could provide to that question that was asked. But just I, not really a trick, but a method of a discursive method for talking to people is the Socratic method. Ask them questions, right? People come to you with this real sense of certainty in their opinions. Start asking them questions, and they will themselves end up in what in Greek is called the state of aporia, a state of confusion where they realize that all the really solid opinions that they had before they started talking to you weren't that solid, right? They were the sorts of opinions that you take a light hammer and you crush them, right? They don't hold. So I think asking questions is always an important part of the process of talking to people. And then once your legs begin to get shaky and the opinion begins to fall, then you bring in the hammer and you bring in the facts, right?
For sure. That's great advice. That was better than mine. We got another super chat. Thank you, Jan R. Getting all the super chats today. Thank you all for the support. Gonna get Carlos like 3 new routers. With all this. But this is a good, interesting question. And this is something we've talked about and thought about before too. But hi guys, wanted to know: do you think there's something useful in the Western left? Do we need to associate communism with leftism? I don't know. I don't think we need to associate it with leftism. I think we need to associate it with class struggle. I mean, it depends on who you're talking to, right? If you're talking to someone who's already in DSA or considers themselves a leftist or a Bernie person, then yeah, it's going to be a little different than talking to a John Deere worker who's on strike or whatever, who voted for Trump. But I mean, some people have completely disavowed the Western left. But what I think is there's a lot of really good people, a lot of class focused working class or working class people in the Western left who have been bullied and silenced by the sort of really, really loud minority of sort of woke, cancel culture minded, identity politics obsessed people. And now there's sort of a backlash against those people within the left and within a lot of those spaces. So I think there are many, 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 many individuals within the Western left worth being salvaged. I don't know if we, um, need to salvage every part of it, such as, things like the hyper focus on identity politics and things need to be criticized. But um, yeah, ultimately, in a class struggle, as communists, as people trying to end capitalism, we are the left, though. I mean, that's always what the left, in terms of communism, has meant. Moving away from capitalism. So, I don't know. You want to take a stab at that question, Carlos?
Yeah. I think I disagree a little bit with the last thing you said in terms of what left has always meant, because I think that what left means changes historically. Like it meant something during the French Revolution, it means something else at the beginning of the 20th century, and then now it means something else, right? And I think that the last meaning it held was like Marxism. That's what left was signified as, or at least socialism. And I think today that's not necessarily the case, right? And if you look at the discourse that shapes most of politics, in the minds of most people, left means the Democrats, and that's an imperialist party, right? So it depends on what we're referring to as left. But I think that you mean by left, just like socialist, Bernie people, and I think that, our approach should always be to organize based on class, not ideology. We shouldn't be seeking out people who think a certain way in order to then organize them. We should be seeking out working people, right? Or poor people in general, right? That's what we should focus on organizing, and then educating them according to the principles of Marxism Leninism, and to what we really need in order to construct socialism in the US. But yeah, like I when I think of organizing and reaching out, I the first thing that comes to mind is not like left or right or Democrat or Republicans. It's like working people, people who are struggling, which can have socially, a variety of views, but on their everyday life, they share the same experiences and hardships as people who have opposing social views. And a lot of the times when they have the social views that I personally don't identify with, some of the more conservative social views, um, when they have those social views that are sometimes anti uh, marginalized and oppressed communities, it's a direct result of ideology. And it's not a working class ideology, it's a ruling class ideology that foists, that imposes things like racism and religion based hatred, and hatred based on sex and orientation and all these other forms of hatred to divide the working people. So we should always serve as a unifying force that brings working people together, and that in doing so and focusing on what's common, which is class struggle, it's able to overcome the divisions that are artificially foisted on the working class.
I like what you said about how Americans see left and right, because ultimately we want to see things based on class, more so than people's political ideas. But it's also good to understand the way people see these terms and these labels in the country that we're in, or with the working class that we're dealing with. And I was referring to like inner Marxist debates. Usually you call right opportunism, being opportunist in favor of capitalism, and left opportunism as being an ultra. Um, but when we're talking about the American proletariat, people think left is like Hillary Clinton liberal. They think like Hillary Clinton is even more left than Joe Biden, because she's more liberal or what. I mean, people have ridiculous ideas, but ultimately they picture the Democrats as left. So they have, their association with left is corruption and imperialism. So that's a good thing to understand. That's why it's like good to always bring it back to class, because we're trying to, get people to disconnect from that system, because if they are paying attention to politics at all, it just sucks you into the circus, and we want to get people disconnected from the circus, so that they can see things by class rather than by the left and right blinders of the American political system.
Did you hear that Santa Claus is running for office as a DSA candidate?
No way.
Yeah, there's a guy in Alaska that he looks like Santa Claus, and he's put his name, he's made his name Santa Claus, and he's running for office, and he's a DSA guy. And George Galloway had him on not too long ago, and he asked him, "What's the class composition in your area?" And the guy said, "There's a few Democrats, there's a few Republicans," and he just started talking about the Democrats and the Republicans. And George Galloway was like, "Dude, what?" But it's so ridiculous, and I think it goes back to how we think of organizing, right? We have to, and we saw it in the Bernie campaign. Whose doors were we knocking? People who had voted Democrat before. They didn't tell us go to working class neighborhoods and organize working people. They told us go try to organize liberals who've voted Democrat, or working people who voted Democrat. But it was usually middle class neighborhoods of PMC folks that were set on Buttigieg or Kamala or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's a great example, and I mean that's George Galloway getting a taste of what DSA is like. I guess, no offense if you're in DSA. DSA does some good work, but that's funny. It says Santa Claus is running against Sarah Palin. Is that true? That's what it said.
That's the most ridiculous race I've ever heard of in my life. Oh my god, America's a fucking circus.
Did you
Holy
watch the
shit.
stream we were doing? The earlier stream we did today was literally just us looking at the most ridiculous elections of all time, and me
Oh
just
my
like
god.
going off like I went to school for this shit. I studied politics. It cost me so much money, and then this is the shit I get. It's like Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz is running in Pennsylvania versus John Fetterman, who's this guy who graduated from Harvard, who like every time he's in public, he's wearing a Carhartt jacket, like. The Republican staff, I mean, the Democratic staffers are just trying to make him look like a working class Pennsylvania guy. And he's running against Dr. Oz from TV. Herschel Walker, former Vikings running back, is running. Oh, this was one of my favorite videos from the whole Trump era. I don't know if you've seen this one. The lady who says that
she has definitely got some.
Jesus appeared to her son in his closet and told her to run for office. Have you seen? Do you want to watch this quick?
Behind deciding to run for this office?
First of all, I'm a prophetic dreamer. So I had spent a lot of 2019 and 20 having a lot of political dreams that I was in office. And because our youngest son, Ezekiel, is a seer, I went and got him. And I said, hey, can you look around and see what you're seeing? Because I just really, I get a kick out of hearing him describe, what he sees. And so I said, let me know if you see anything. And so he looked in my bedroom and my bathroom and he said, there's nothing there. And then he goes into the closet, which is where I had been when I was praying. And he said, whoa. And his eyes got like big as saucers. And he kind of like started backing away and they started bending down. And he said, you've got a really big guy in your closet. And his power is pushing me to the ground. And he'd never had that reaction ever to an angel. Whoa. And so I'm like, he's for us, not against us, right? Because I was very it's a different response. And he's like, he's full of light. He's so full of light, I can't even see his face. And then he said, and he has a scroll in his hand. And so I was like, then he came with a message. Like, what is the message?
That is Rachel Ham. She's
like, dude, this is what happens. This is like the bourgeois political system in a late stage of decay.
That might have been the devil too. It was pushing him down, not up. So the kid might have been a dickhead, and the devil wanted him earlier than he could have gotten him. So
after that,
so funny.
Ezekiel opened the door and he was sucked into hell. Like, he came back, he's like, you wouldn't believe the shit I've seen, Mom. Like,
oh my God.
I've been through the 7 circles of hell.
That's
I don't think that lady won her life.
Every politician has been through that. That's how they all get sucked in. Oh my God.
All right. Well, you have anything else you want to talk about?
No, I don't know. It's getting pretty late, but if you have anything to react to, I'd be happy to. I took a nap today after class, so I have some energy. But
I don't have anything pulled up. There's one video someone sent about how Harvard created the Unabomber.
Oh my God.
I think that's.
Someone mentioned something about Miami DSA being lit. Let me see if I find it. So
I heard that too. That they're like tankies.
I met up with some comrades from Miami DSA a few weeks ago. They're pretty cool. They are tankies. They're fucking tankies. I love them. They're great. But yeah. It varies so much. It's such a big tent thing that it's really it depends on the chapter that you're in, and that's pretty much the same with most organizations. There's some CPUSA clubs that think a little differently than others. And I'm guessing it's something similar with PSL. It's hard to sustain such ideological homogeneity in such a big country. Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's something we've been talking about forever, how the U.S. has different cultural areas and how, the sort of struggle for socialism will probably look different in every place. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm sorry I don't have any videos unless you had anything you wanted to watch.
Well, I was hoping. I think we've been trying to coordinate to bring Steven Estrada on, and there's a few good videos of Gus Hall promoting his candidacy for president online. And I was showing it to my wife the other day just to like highlight the difference between the modern left and the left, or modern communism, and what it was like 40 years ago, where the bread and butter issues were the ones focused on. It was building an anti-monopoly coalition. He even talked about like taxes, which I don't think that's something that I've heard talked about from a Marxist perspective in a long time. I think
Right now, Joe Biden's expanding the IRS, which working people are pissed about. It's a good thing to hit on.
Right. So it was, a lot of his promotional candidacy videos are on the money. I don't know if you want to read.
Yeah, I've got them pulled up here. You want to watch the one with Angela Davis or this one with him? This one's short.
I think the 3-minute one. Yeah, that's the one one of the ones I saw.
This looks good.
Propaganda, consumerism. In Cuba, there's no advertisement for like just consumerist shit.
No way.
Commercials are based on like promoting culture and then news. So it's so I wonder like the effects that it has on the popular consciousness when you don't turn on things to watch something and you're constantly bombarded by shit to buy.
Right. No kidding. I don't know why Gus is muted.
What a stash too.
No kidding. It should be playing.
On that, do you think that President Nixon...
Maybe it's just the first part of the video. Yeah.
Mr. Hall, the United States is hardly chilly. What chance do you think you really have in entering the 72 elections?
Well, we, of course, will enter the elections full speed. In the sense of placing our program and our ideas, to the American people. But as far as getting elected, of course, we have no illusions about that this year.
President Nixon has come out with a new economic proposal plan, and I was wondering your comment on that. Do you think that President Nixon is working in the right direction?
See, with American capitalism, the top priority is corporate profits. And everything Nixon does, and in fact everything the Democratic administrations have done, is with an eye to safeguard this top priority, which is profits for the private corporations. And we, of course, propose that fundamentally we will wipe that off the list of priorities. And what Nixon has done with the so-called wage price freeze is really to protect these corporate profits, because the fact remains that the big corporations were notified in advance of the freeze, and therefore they raised their prices. And now the only concrete thing that is really coming out of the Nixon program is not only a freeze in wages, but a rollback in wages, because they are not permitting the wage increases that the unions have negotiated. So the only thing that comes out of it is a freeze and a rollback of wages for the workers. And in that sense, it's a total fraud.
Mr. Tyner, you are under the age that the Constitution allows the Vice President to be. Do you think that in terms of your candidacy, you're really there to appeal to younger people?
Yeah, and we're there also to say that that law that does not permit me to run is a lot of garbage, and I should have a right to be Vice President of the United States, just like any young person gives their life for this country and their ventures abroad and so on. And if Spiro Agnew can be President of the United States, I know damn well I can be Vice President of the United States.
My name is Alethea.
It's so good.
Hostile
They have
mainstream.
swagger. They're not weak, and they're focused on the issues. They're focused on
Right,
class.
right, and they're criticizing harshly both parties, right? Getting it clear, they're both capitalist, imperialist parties. That's sometimes I don't want to say forgotten, but underemphasized. And Yeah, there's so many of those that are really good. There's one that it's like 3 minutes and it's just him talking to the camera. Um, but it's bread and butter issues. It's stuff that like no working person will see and be like, oh, I disagree with anything like this. It was also at a time where I think that some of the resources were in place so that you could just go on federal TV and do something like that. I remember I've talked to Tom before, and he's like, when I was young, I'd turn on the TV and you'd have like the Socialist Labor Party candidate talking and a Communist Party candidate talking, and they would each get 30 minutes, just like the Democrats and the Republicans. So I don't know what it was that made them or when it stopped being something like that, but I feel like the screen time was a little bit more distributed in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, definitely communications have been monopolized. Even with the internet has led to more free communication, but that's been clamped down on and is owned by a few people. And they've been conglomerated, but also like I think as socialists to self-criticize, like we have to be more serious too. Like it's almost like some people treat Marxism and socialism as a social club, and then it sort of becomes this like cringy subculture that's not very serious to regular Americans, or not presenting itself as a serious political ideology confronting the serious problems within our society. And I think that's what you see Gus Hall doing there. Like him and his vice president, they're like in suits, they look presentable, and they're just staying calm and sticking to their message, sticking to their program, which is a program that appeals to people universally and just says the truth. So not that that's the end all be all. As Gus Hall and what the Communist Party was able to do in the past at times when they were larger and more influential, but I don't know. There is stuff to learn there. I think for sure.
Right, right. Jarvis Tyner, which is the guy running for vice president, he just turned 80 recently, and the party did a big celebration for him. And Angela Davis actually sent in a video wishing him happy birthday, which is cool. I mean, we know that she's gone quite lib after she left the party, but
I mean, it might have been when she might have been part of the transition. I don't want to get too deep into it, but she might have helped turn CPUSA a little lib before she left. But.
Right, right. She was part of that split. Although I've heard different reasons for the split in '91. One of the ones that I heard was that that it was because they rejected the coup that Gorbachev was trying to do. There was a coup going on against Gorbachev because of perestroika, and that people left because of that, because they felt that it was undemocratic. But then I heard someone else who said, no, that's bullshit. That's not why it was. It was, there was no democratic centralism or something, right? Um, but yeah, it's bread and butter issues that attract a lot of people. They look very professional doing so, and Lenin was very clear that we have to create working class politicians, and that when you're in a condition where you're surrounded by wolves, you're going to have to learn how to howl, and that means putting up some, not the whole gimmick that most politicians do, right? We saw that failed in part. Trump won because the American people are tired of that gimmick, but we do have to look professional, right? We can't show up with like a Batman shirt or something to a presidential thing.
And I mean that can look different though. Like Chris Smalls, the guy who's been unionizing Amazon and has become sort of a leader for labor. He has his thing where he wears like a snapback and the fashion of the place he's from and of his coworkers.
Right.
He's authentic in that, and it's become iconic. I'm not saying you have to wear a suit and be a stick up, but be smart in how you present yourself and your ideas.
I'm a
Um,
fan of suits, so I go with suits. But he's got the Jeff Hamilton. I think the old school Jeff Hamilton jackets that are super fucking dope.
they're fucking awesome. I love
He
his.
always
I
has
like
great
everything.
shades. Always has great shades. I think
He
he's
does.
pretty dripped up. But yeah.
Well, thanks for the $5, Paul. I'm sorry we didn't get to your question earlier. We
Now
were,
it makes it seem like we only answered it because he sent $5, and
yeah, I know.
I wanted to go back to find it and pull it up, and I kept on not finding it, so I just said fuck it. Uh,
Just we're just trying to milk Paul for everything he's worth here. But with China in the primary stage of NEP for a while, aren't there productive forces advanced enough to transition away from NEP? Yeah, I think they are. I mean, they're in sort of. I feel like they're almost in the very, very preliminary stages of that. And I know they've got. They want to. I don't know what's the wording they use. Something like a higher stage or a very high stage of socialism by 2049 or whatever. But the anti-corruption efforts, the poverty alleviation programs, things like this. They executed billionaires a while back, sort of cracking down on people who were making a lot of money, speculators who were making a lot of money off the education system, trying to reform that. So I think we have seen sort of a growth of what Xi Jinping would call the visible hand, in sort of restraining the invisible hand. How much that will continue, remains to be seen. But I imagine that China will start to be transforming out of that NEP stage now. I mean, especially like not that the U.S. imperialism has been leaving them alone, but ever since they opened up their borders, the U.S. hasn't been able to just or hasn't been looking to just do regime change against China. Now they are. And I don't know. Anytime the U.S. has been directly looking to overthrow a country, and the conditions have been different in historically much different than what China's going through now. But that always leads to like a more top-down Stalinist, more traditional socialist planning model. As the economies are prepared to defend from whatever invasion. So as the U.S. sort of new Cold War heats up with China, I don't know, that could have effects on their economy too. I don't know if they'll move towards like a more Stalinist model, or if you could even describe it as that now, because like I said, their conditions are so much different than like China under Mao or the USSR under Stalin, when you saw these more top-down planned models. But I don't know, maybe that was a bit of a tangent, but go ahead, Carlos.
Well, they're moving towards what they're calling common prosperity, which is the national equivalent of, I forget the phrasing that they're used, but they're really good at making phrases in order to signify the new stages that they're entering. But they're entering into a new stage where they're really trying to crack down on the inequalities that were created. And first of all, they're conscious that there's different types of inequalities. There's the inequality between the developed countries and China. They've bridged that, and then there's also the question of need. They've been able to raise, you know, 900 million people out of poverty. So they improved the lives of a lot of people, but in the process, they made a lot of other people rich, and it led to internal inequalities within China. And now with Xi Jinping over the last few years, they've turned towards trying to address that, and the term that they're using for it is common prosperity, building, a prosperous, a growth that is more, that's distributed more equally. And I think that right now, I think that our concern should be less with like the ideals, in the sense of like the stuff that's written on the text of what, the higher stage of socialism is going to look like and all that stuff, because we're at a very hot point in history in terms of geopolitics, right? You have the U.S. constantly escalating geopolitical conflicts with countries that do have nuclear powers, and that don't want conflict, that want win-win relations with other countries. But the U.S. is not willing to lose its unipolar hegemony over the world. So I don't think that, like, a question of when is the next transition, the next stage, the next higher stage in socialism going to occur. Not that it's not important, but we have to realize that like they've already done so much, and China is a sort of country, and you see this. I've mentioned a few times that I watch all these vlogs from people in China, and there's people that like got to China. They went to one province 3 years ago, and they lived for a few months, and then they go back, and in 3 years they've built like everything. It looks like a new fucking place. And so China's constantly improving, and they're the sort of they they engage in the sort of politics because they're led by a communist party that has the interests of people and not profit at heart. They're led by the sort of politics that when they say they're going to do something, they do it. It's the complete opposite of the U.S., where the politician can say whatever their ass feels like saying, and they don't have to do anything. Right? They're not held accountable for the things that they say that they were going to do. Um, so I I think that we should maybe put aside some of the concerns with regards to China's economy because they're lifting people out of poverty, and they're making the living standards of Chinese extremely high, higher than than ours. I know that for a fact. There's less stress going on in everyday society. They're promoting cultural change. That's beautiful, and it's both at the level of popular culture and high culture, so like intellectual culture. Um, so they're doing really great things, and I think that the important thing is to see how they've been able to expropriate political power. One of the distinctions that Mao makes is between the expropriation of political versus economic power. And the traditional Marxist theory was that you expropriate economic power and the state. And then they realized that, well, in certain contexts where the most important thing is to have the state develop so that it could protect itself, to have the forces of production develop along with science, technology, security, military. In those contexts, what really the expropriation that really matters is political expropriation. So I think that perhaps for the next few decades, the importance is still going to be laid on the political expropriation, not allowing any bourgeois political influence. And I think that insofar as they continue to secure that, they're going to continue doing good things for their citizenry, and continue to have the ability, because of how developed the productive forces have already gotten, to be able to crack down harder on the monopolies that are doing practices that go against the common good. They have in each company, according to the number of employees, they have a number of Communist Party members, and they're in charge of making sure that the company is structured according to the common good, so that the sort of practices that happen in every country and every company in the U.S. don't happen over there in China. So
I think there's also like a resistance in China because they call the Cultural Revolution like one of the biggest mistakes in their country's history.
right.
There's a mistake to try and control things too much or to try and put theory above practice, right? To put theory above material development. Like these changes in science and in culture and in academia stem from their changes in production. And the way that they've controlled and managed production using what they call the visible hand with some of the methods Carlos was describing and some of the ones we've described in the past, like the party cadres who are in charge of certain areas and making sure people's economic needs are met. They're not trying to control everything on such a level that they advance through these specific stages of socialism that Marx laid out in the Gotha program or whatever. They're trying to develop their productive forces in a mode of common prosperity, as Carlos was saying. They're trying to develop other countries around the world with the Belt and Road, who have been prevented from developing by imperialism. They're trying to maintain their sovereignty. And, they talk about reaching a higher stage of socialism by 2049, but I think what that's going to mean is more common prosperity. And it might, involve more visible versus invisible hand, as I was saying, but I think only time will tell. And it'll depend on what happens with the U.S. and U.S. politics. There could be a revolution in the U.S. tomorrow, and we all move towards a higher stage of socialism or more quickly. And but I think you're right that people put too much on these stages of development. And I've seen people do that with 2049 is when China moves to real socialism. It's like, that's not what it is. That's not what they're saying when they talk about 2049. They're talking about establishing common prosperity, and moving to a higher stage of development, whatever that's shown to be, based on continued material development that benefits everyone.
Right. You had mentioned something when we first started that I wrote down to say something about it, and I ended up never saying it, but we've rolled back to China. And you mentioned how we were talking about Gramsci, and you were talking about the focus of the mass line that's emphasized by the Chinese communists, and the focus on culture, and that's also grounded in what came before the founding of the Communist Party, because the major movement was the New Culture movement that was led by the people that then founded in 1921 the Communist Party of China, um, and their focus was on having the sort of cultural revolution that detached people from the existing Confucian and feudal values and reattach them to modern. At that time, they're aiming for bourgeois values of democracy and science. People like John Dewey played a relatively big influence in some of the ideas, but eventually they get to Marxism. But it'd be interesting to look at. I don't know if people have done work on this. I mean, there's 1.4 billion Chinese and a shitload of scholars. So I'm sure they have, but it'd be interesting to see to what extent does that very embryonic focus on culture and cultural revolution, to what extent was that somewhat of the sort of foundation or the embryo for something like the sort of extremism that comes about during the cultural revolution, as we know? Um,
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I even have anything to expand on that. Hopefully, we answered Paul's question thoroughly.
those are good questions.
Definitely.
I think it's a worthwhile question. I think it'd also be interesting to study, to do a comparative analysis of how China allows a sort of dominated uh, bourgeois economy to exist within their socialism, and how that compares to the Eastern socialist experiments that played around with what's called socialist markets, or with state capitalism, whatever term you want to use it. I think those sort of comparative analysis would be a good place to start in thinking about how their NAP style policies have developed over the last 2-3 decades since the 1978 reform and opening up process.
Definitely, and that's what they're always doing. It's really interesting to read if you look within, like, the Chinese Communist Party. They're always like, here's what Yugoslavia did, and here's what Tito did, and here's where they opened up, and adjusting their policy based on what others have done. And of course, in the West, none of that's allowed, because all existing socialism's evil, right? And it was just a bunch of dictators eating all the food. So we're not even allowed to have these conversations about China's socialism versus Tito's Yugoslavia or whatever. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a good place it's an interesting topic of research or place to look.
It's interesting because they do that. They do say that they keep the people poor so that the bureaucrats at the top can be super rich and eat all the food they want. And it's like, well, how are most of them fit?
Right.
One of these days, we're going to see on one of these fitness magazines, "Get fit in 1 week." The trick that Stalin used to eat all the Ukrainians' food but stay fit.
Right. It's got to be like the greatest weight loss technique in the world.
You
Stalin
can
just
eat
got some
the
secret
food of a
water he
million.
drank.
Right. You can eat the food of 1 million people and stay slim or something.
How this man ate the food of over 1 million Ukrainians and still stayed fit enough to rob banks.
Right. I think Kayla, her next episode of Debunking Ukrainian Nationalism, which is a show I think everyone should check out, is going to be about Holodomor. So that should
Let's go.
be good.
I love it. Yeah, we want to have Kayla on stream soon to interview her about her series. So look forward to that. Yeah. Should we call it here? You got anything else you want to discuss, Carlos, before we head out?
No, that's it. It's pretty. I think we touched on quite a bit of things, and I know you had a stream earlier, so I'm sure you're tired.
For sure. This was a good one, though. We went about 2 hours, so yeah. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for all the super chats. Really appreciate it. Hope you learned something. Yeah. Thank you, Carlos, for being on and dropping some philosophy knowledge on us. I know you're super busy, but it's always a pleasure to get to stream with you. So yeah.
Likewise, brother. I'm hoping to be a little bit more free within the coming week. The central project that's been taking my time, I'm hoping to somewhat conclude it soon. So I need to figure out the goddamn Wi-Fi, but I'll play with that tomorrow, and hopefully I can hop on these more often. And yeah, thank you all
Awesome.
for watching.
You bet. All right. Peace out, everyone.